And for those of us working in international development, I think we've seen that the future trends and the future world that we're operating in is going to be significantly different from the past. And actually, many of us are spending time thinking, what are the future models of development? How do we need to adapt our organizations? And seeing that there have been some big shifts over the last decade. If we think about the role that the private sector has played, we've seen some significant changes. We've got Christelle here from Vodafone, and who would have thought that actually it's Vodafone that's been transforming the treatment that women receive in Tanzania for obstetric, it's such a hard word to say, obstetric. Forget it, fistula. And it's through their Text for Treatment program that they've actually been able to help address some of the challenges around both awareness of this condition, but also provide the facility for people to be able to pay to travel to the hospitals to have the operations. Who would have thought that the Global Fund would actually be giving or granting $130 million to Ashanti, to Anglo-Ashanti Gold for the work that they're doing around malaria? And who would have thought that we would have seen non-profits taking over for-profits and these fundamentally new different models that are emerging? So this isn't something new for us in that some of you will remember, those of you that have been, I'm looking at James here, involved with us for many years, that in 2011 we launched the Convergence Economy. And that talked about the barriers coming down between the sectors and the fact that we thought this convergence of interests and issues and solutions was really going to be increasing over the next 5 to 10 years. And I think it's fair to say that that has absolutely happened. At the time, some of the people we spoke to thought we were a bit mad. They couldn't really get what we were talking about. The silos were very much there. But we've definitely seen this shift happening, and we think this shift is only going to continue. We had the CEO of one of our NGO clients say, I really didn't get what you were talking about then, but I do get it now, and we've seen that change happen. So I'm going to hand over to Ian in a minute, who's going to talk about the continuum and the different kind of elements that we see along it, and explain how we see it evolving and the emergence of this kind of fourth sector as we refer to in the report.
Thank you, Louise. So for brief introductions, my name's Ian Lobo. I run partnership services within Accenture. It's been a very interesting journey over the last 10 years, which kind of maps out with this Convergence Continuum. So as you've probably seen within the piece, the first stage was kind of those early stage partnerships. So we're starting beyond that philanthropic giving and moving into more collaborative, shared value type partnerships in the early days. So companies working in a more collaborative way with NGOs. As we start moving down the continuum and evolving from the successes that have been established with those initial partnerships, we're seeing more partners getting involved, so what we're calling the multi-sector coalitions. So a really good example of that could be something such as the United Nations Sustainable Energy for All, which is bringing together multiple organizations with a broad set of focuses around a multitude of goals, whether it's around energy efficiency, access, or renewables. So with those types of coalitions, it's about kind of a common cluster of organizations focusing on a direction. And then with that, being able to mobilize organizations, whether it's governments, whether it's private sector companies, whether it's NGOs, in order to start mobilizing some of these partnerships and starting to move the needle. So what those coalitions do is they provide a starting point for that dialogue, a starting point for sharing some of the learnings, and then from there, more of these interesting, impactful, integrated, connected partnerships can start to evolve. Then when we start to get a bit more innovative and where we've actually started tightening up some of these coalitions rather from these collectives, we're getting into something which much more issue-focused. And issue-focused platforms is what we're calling them here. A good example of this, again in the energy access space, is the Global Alliance for Clean Cook Stoves. And if anyone was following kind of the recent events, especially last month, there's currently about 1,500 partners. They're delivering this really with the national buy-in of the governments when they're trying to address this issue. What has been kind of phenomenal with this coalition, but actually more It's expanded beyond just talking, bringing together organizations. It's about bringing in innovative sources of capital. So for instance, through the Spark Fund that they have to fund these entrepreneurs to develop their solutions and drive it forward. Another one of the major press releases last month was about 400 million plus committed by governments. 120, I think it was committed, 120 million was committed by the Bank of America and Deutsche Bank for investment funds. So it's really with these issues trying to mobilize resource in an unprecedented scale that we haven't seen before. So this is kind of a nice kind of gradient and step forward, moving beyond great ideas, we want to focus on an issue, to really mobilizing the organizations, mobilizing the governments, and really mobilizing the capital, which is what we need. So we're here, of course, to talk about the fourth sector and what's next. So based on some of our experience, if anyone's kind of worked in partnerships, you know how difficult they are. And it's still going to be a critical way for collaboration between organizations to address these goals. We know we can't do it on our own, private sector can't do it, NGOs can't do it, the governments can't do it. So we do very much believe in collaboration. With the fourth sector, what we're starting to see is an emergence of hybrid organizations. So one example of that is spent a couple of years working with the World Health Organization on setting up and launching the new HIV/AIDS medicines patent pool. So it was a massive issue about how do we get HIV meds, the ARVs, out to millions across the world in developing countries. UN couldn't do it on its own. It wasn't really that profitable for pharma. But how do we create this new organization which could kind of bring the best of the different organizations to focus on this through collaborative licensing? So those types of initiatives where we're saying, well, actually, I can't host this within the UN for various reasons. I can't host this within a company. I can't host this within an NGO. How do we create something new as a new separate legal entity? So that's kind of one of the trends, that we are seeing of what's next. Again, complementary to those other types of coalitions or point solutions that may be happening. But again, a step forward about what we can expect to see more and more. So we will definitely have some opportunity to take questions, talk more about the fourth sector. But we'll hand it over now to Louise to talk about some of the disruptions that we're seeing, which is actually creating the demand for these fourth sector organizations.
Thanks, Ian. So if we think about these new models emerging, well then what is actually accelerating and enabling this trend? And there are two things that we highlight in the report which we think have or currently are playing a very disruptive role. The first one is around the role of technology and digital. And if we think about the transformative impact that technology has had on the private sector, we think we're only beginning to scratch the surface about what it means for international development. Last Friday, we held a session with many of our NGO clients, spending a whole day looking at digital disruption in the sector. And it was just really interesting to look at some of the unique examples and forward-thinking examples of the application of technology and how that's going to change over time. And just to give you a couple of examples that I particularly like and that stood out for me, there's an organization called Opternative, which is basically looking at developing the first eye test that can be done fully online. So you don't need to have access to an optician to actually do this test. You can do the test, you can generate the prescription, and the ability to be able to do this in remote areas where you can get connectivity, but you can't necessarily get access to the clinics and the people. So if you think about that and you think, well, connectivity, do we really have it anywhere? Do we really have it everywhere? Well, the second example is Google. So Google is actually looking at investing significantly to improve internet access in sub-Saharan Africa. And they are creating these Google airships. So if you think about those airships that you see up in the sky, and actually that enables them to allow and install a wireless network with a huge range. So they want to make a significant investment to increase the accessibility of wireless. So if you think about the access to the technology, plus coupled with the example I gave you around the eye care, you can see how we can really start to think about addressing challenges in a different way. And then the final example that I'll mention is called Crowdflower. And this is about actually crowdsourcing information in a humanitarian context. This was used in the Philippines after there had been a typhoon. They were actually able to use social media and look at the tweets that were coming through to actually capture information about where the damage had occurred. And they did geotagging to then be able to build up this image for OCHA to say, actually, these are the houses, the bridges that are damaged. This is where we see the worst flooding. So again, there is so much that we're going to see over the next decade around digital disruption. There is so much potential. And we really need, as people who are working in the development sector, to think about the opportunities that that presents for our organizations. The second area is around innovative financing. It's a buzz term that we've started to hear a bit of over the last few years, but again, we think this is only going to increase massively. The market is predicted to be $1 trillion by 2020. So we are just starting there now. There's been some examples in the UK, but we're starting to hear about the examples in the international development context. How can we use development impact bonds to really bring different sources of capital in to address international development challenges? We did some work with the Brookings Institute around education, and we firmly believe that actually there's an economic case for investing in education, because if you look at the return on GDP by keeping people, particularly girls, in education, then it makes complete economic sense. So actually, why aren't we creating a development impact bond around education and selling it to government as a way of actually increasing the economic growth of the country? So these are just a couple of examples. There are more in the report, but really to just sort of get you thinking about the role that technology and financing plays. So given everything we've said, what does this mean if you're the CEO of an NGO, if you're leading a business unit in a company like Christelle, or if you're working in government? Well, just a couple of reflections. We think for government, they will be the choreographer for outcomes. They will care less who actually delivers the service. It's going to be competency-based, based on who is the best provider. Whether you're in the private sector, whether you're in civil society, it doesn't matter. Can you deliver the outcomes that they desire? They need to be more flexible. They need to be thinking about these new financing mechanisms and technology and really play that choreographing role to make sure that they are supporting access to basic public services. What does it mean for business? Well, business as well needs to be thinking more broadly about how it can kind of turn these development challenges into business opportunities, and actually think about how they can partner, not just with cross-sector, but with other businesses as well. We talk in the report about the GSK Barclays example, where they are partnering together in Zambia around health. And certainly where we sit, we're increasingly seeing businesses thinking, well, who are my main corporate clients? And how can I actually partner with them on areas that are of mutual interest to both of us? And I think that leaves an interesting question maybe for the NGOs and for civil society is, if you see an increased role for business and you see businesses working with other businesses, well, where does that leave civil society in here? And how can we make sure that civil society doesn't get disintermediated and that actually the rights of people are considered very strongly in these new business models that emerge? So we think that civil society organizations should also be thinking about what are the skills and the capabilities that we need in this changing and emerging environment, and how can we actually adapt to make sure that we are at the table and we're making sure that the rights and the voices of those who don't normally have such a strong voice are actually represented in these new business models and discussions. So with that, I will pass to you, Graham.
Thank you, Louise. Louise and Ian, for that good summary of this report, which I must say I read with great interest. It's a fascinating progression in thinking, if I may say so, for those of us who have worked in cross-sectoral partnerships, and certainly, if nothing else, very thought-provoking. Vodafone is a company which has long experience in partnerships and indeed in making a significant impact in the international development agenda. M-Pesa must be the most quoted example in all of the literature. And goes back a long time. We tend to forget. It's many, many years now. So, Christelle, from your perspective, you've had a chance to have a look at this report. What ideas does it stimulate in your mind from the private sector perspective?
So, first of all, in the first comment, that in terms of the findings, development goes digital. it's interesting to see. I mean, things have been moving slowly in the last 4 years, but I can see them accelerating at the moment. So for us, it started with receiving aid from USAID. It was a 5 million grant that we matched, but not to do, to do philanthropic work, but to do innovation using our technology to support agriculture in emerging markets. And the aim of that grant that we've received from USAID is not to carry on doing it as a philanthropic activity, but it's for us to move to the commercial space. So this money was used in a pre-commercial space, and success now is that in 3 of our markets in Africa, we are offering a mobile solution for agriculture on a commercial basis. When I say commercial, it scares some people off, thinking, it's big corporate looking after making yet more money. Our belief is that the scaling happens in the commercial angle of it, and this is what we're good at. And this is, if it's not commercial, it will remain a philanthropic activity for Vodafone, and will not scale beyond the 1% of our profit that we give to charity. So it's very important for us. I guess it's still an innovation piece, because the scale that we're talking about in terms of revenue is nothing in comparison to the size of the business. So it is an investment into the future, not a pure revenue play. Another example will be going back to M-Pesa. M-Pesa was born again from Vodafone. It's a Vodafone service that is available in mobile payment, but available in 7 markets in Africa. Now it's been launched in India and in Romania also, out of all markets. And interestingly, this was born out of a convergence relationship, because actually the person in my shoes quite a few years ago saw the potential for that solution to make a big difference in emerging markets, pitched it to the business, and I must say at the time, the business didn't necessarily see the potential or understand how simple and big this could be. And we received some funding from DFID to go out and innovate, and now the rest is history. And it's again, going back to my first point, it's commercial, not commercial on the scale of Vodafone in terms of our level of revenue, and it's still a baby within the big corporate. However, the reputation that it generates, the branding and the credibility that it gives our brand is what we get back commercially from it. So don't want to hog all the
Well, there's also something in there about long-term thinking. So one of the things that comes through in these fourth sector groupings is this sort of vision for a long-term future. I mean, you say you get reputational benefit from M-Pesa, but you are forming relationships with customers that you would never have touched any other way, who will, in the next 20 years, be the future of your company, maybe.
Absolutely. So building on this, we recently launched what I call sustainability practice for enterprise customers, because we realize that all our biggest customers out there, the like of Unilever, Diageo, SAB Miller, Syngenta, have all got sustainability agendas which are not on the side of their business. They're now part of their strategic core agenda issues, and that if we, as a mobile provider, not mobile telco provider, we want to move from a service provider to being a solution partner, we need to get under the skin of the strategic challenges of those customers. So we're now paying attention with that practice to the challenges faced by those guys, and we're looking at how we can basically, I call it innovation with a small I, is twisting existing technology and applying it to a new set of problems that we wouldn't normally be looking at, really. So that's where innovation lies.
Private to private partnerships.
That's right.
Described. Very good. So Mark, from the NGO perspective, again, Oxfam has a lot of partnerships with the private sector in existence already. How does this challenge you to go further? How do you see yourself positioned relative to the ideas that are presented in this report?
I like making presentations when I can tell people about the great things that Oxfam is doing. This is a presentation where I have to say Oxfam is nowhere near that fourth generation, but the challenge for all the NGO community, as well as for the business and government community, is how do we move in that direction? So let's be clear that the fourth generation, as described in the paper, is only going to apply in some circumstances, and the paper is really clear. It doesn't replace all the other forms of partnership. It complements them. So to me, the challenge coming out of it is how do we shift all of our work further to the right, as it were? The stuff that's at the first or second stage along to the second or the third or the fourth stage. And I want to bring that alive by describing two current challenges that Oxfam and the wider development community are facing. One of them is how we respond to Ebola. So we have a situation where Ebola has spread massively and rapidly in two of the poorest countries in the world with two of the weakest health systems. Conventional approaches to developing vaccines have not happened because there's been no financial incentive to do it. So our approach to public-private partnerships on some of the vaccine development issues and creative financing on vaccine development simply hasn't got us there fast enough. It's accelerating now, but that's one of those areas where you'd be thinking, how does this kind of approach work? Then you get to the fact that there was no really clear early surveillance. We were very slow in picking it up, and after about 3 or 4 months, WHO put up their hand and said, sorry, we didn't get this right. But the kind of use of social media that Louise was describing could have picked it up in days. So Twitter might not be very common in Liberia and Sierra Leone, but Facebook certainly will be, and half a dozen other applications will have millions of users each. And those people who are good on big data have already been able to show us that just by tracking a range of keywords, you can actually see the triggers. You then investigate them in more detail, and you say all of a sudden people aren't recovering from diarrhea, they're dying from it. You pick that up, and in some of the countries which are prone, you have a much quicker response. You then move on to the weakness of health systems, which is the combination of the undertraining and underpaying of health workers, people's lack of access to good information, and the power of some traditional practices that are encouraging the spread. And you see the power of using new media on all of those different functions. Now again, there's a combination here of a profit motive, a state motive, an NGO motive that can be woven together. And I'm not trying to design the detail now. And then you get to the issue of staffing the treatment centres. Now we're really struggling to build to staff what needs to be residential, what needs to be community-based. But we're doing it in some very traditional ways, which is recruiting health workers from other countries, moving them across, whereas the power of the kind of training tools that we've seen being used on the web, the power of training local people much more quickly, the power of using the strongest local companies and enterprises to play a role in that, have all been underused. So none of them have been not used. But if you look at that from a fourth generation lens, you'd say there's some very different partnerships that we could be looking at that could make a difference, not only to this Ebola, but to the next kind of humanitarian disaster. And then switch to a completely different example. And it's one where Oxfam has been engaging with the business community, particularly the food and beverage community, for a number of years. So Oxfam has been running an index called Behind the Brands. It looks at the 10 biggest food companies in the world against 7 main criteria. Behind those criteria, there are literally hundreds of indicators, and it scores them on their ethics, ranging from environment to gender to land to a whole range of other different issues. We've been challenging those companies to sign up to good practice, to promote and inspect and pass this on to their whole supply chain with a reasonable level of success. So we're seeing most of the big food and beverage companies improve their ethical practice as part of their routine business. You get no points for giving money to charity in this. You get points for the way you do your business. But those companies that are doing well are now saying to us, what's next? You know, are you just going to keep chucking stones at us when we go from 60 out of 100 to 65 to 70? You know, we can carry on moving up, but what's the bigger picture? And what the best of them want to do is to say, how do we use this learning to roll it out across the whole sector that's involved in food and beverage, not just the 10 big multinationals, but the ones that basically don't give a damn. Will sell at the lowest price that they have to, will drive down wages, will ignore the environment, will ignore the whole issue of discrimination and abuse within the labour force. And that's where you get to the partnership dimension. So, in a sense, if this challenge, this critical friend approach to behind the brands, is a current generation of challenging corporates to do better, what's the next generation? Now, what's the role of the state in this? What's the role of the NGO sector? What's the role of companies? And what we're seeing, if we have conversations with these companies about things like tax, where they pay tax, who they pay tax to, how much tax they pay, they say, we can't deal with this on our own. We're complying with the law. If the system needs changing, it's got to be done by governments. But it needs to be done in consultation with us so we don't move our business somewhere else. And then it needs someone to be shining a spotlight onto this, which is where the role of NGOs might come in. Equally, when you look at that issue of wage levels, both discriminatory between women and men and absolute, you're looking at many of the better companies saying, but we comply with local wage legislation. They all do. But there's a massive difference between a legal minimum wage and a living wage in many of the countries that they're sourcing from. And again, companies can't deal with that on their own. You know, if one company simply increases its wage levels, the competitive issues are obvious. So again, what's the broader role of alliance building, of governments working with the best to drive good practice? So this is another area where we haven't got it right, but where the paper is setting some challenges to what the next generation of engagement might look like, not to replace traditional NGO involvement on challenging any more than on corporate partnerships, but to actually complement it and say, what can we do together to try and create an environment where poorest communities will be better off in a way that is totally within the business needs of responsible companies and is promoted and regulated by government in an appropriate way. And I think there's a lot further we can go on that journey.
Mark, that's really interesting observations. Can I ask you, from a perspective of a CEO of one of the leading brands in the civil society NGO sector, do you see any challenge in these notions to your brand? We're talking about convergence and collaboration, but with that comes some erosion, does it not, of the impact of your brand? How do you deal with that? How do you preserve the best, if you like, of Oxfam at the same time as getting into this fourth sector concept?
Yeah. I mean, every time we run a partnership with a company, we get huge attack from many activists. And you can look at the best companies and think, actually, this should be an association of two positive forces, which should be more powerful. And I think the thinking behind the fourth sector thinking is this is more powerful, even more if you put government within it. So that's what we have to strive for. Yeah. But we do get challenged. And I think our job, our ultimate measure of a right to exist is, are we doing something which is making a bigger difference to poor people than would have happened otherwise? So if you look at a partnership on engaging rural women in the supply chain of a large company, just to stick with the food example, some people will say, well, you're selling out to that company. The issue is that company have every right to run an enterprise, could be running an enterprise well, but it's not usually in their commercial interest to engage the most marginal women in producing. They've probably had less education, they're probably less mobile, there are more constraints. So our job is to do that, and that's what we have to stay confident in. But the challenge is there. I think we've got to brave it out. And the other side is we've got to be willing to challenge openly when that's what's required. And I think that the difficulty in the fourth generation, using the food examples which I was majoring on there, is can you both challenge a company and partner with it in this kind of way? We think you have to be able to, but we haven't quite got there yet.
Louise, just before I open it up to the audience, so I'm sure I'll have lots of questions, I just wanted to ask you about one of the nice analogies which I see you draw in the report, which is about knocking the house down and starting again rather than adding on further extensions to the existing house. Most of us in the room, I suspect, have had some experience, or maybe actually now, working in existing partnerships. Is it a place from which you can start and progress, do you think, in your analysis? Or do you actually need to clear the decks and start again?
Yeah, Graham, I think it was interesting. That house analogy came up when we, as a team, were really sort of thrashing out this full sector concept. And we thought, actually, this is kind of, in a way, the best way of describing it, where you almost get to a point where the complexity, like you alluded to, in working in these multi-stakeholder coalitions, these network issue-based platforms, just almost becomes too much. And you're actually better off you get to this sort of tipping point and say, you know what, actually, let's just start from scratch and set up a simple structure that is focused on a specific issue. So you might still have the same organizations involved, but they're all working now for this one new hybrid business model. And instead of having to worry about the brand for their organization, like we've just talked about, and having to say, well, I'm representing the UN, I'm representing Oxfam, I'm here to represent Vodafone or Accenture, actually you're changing that dynamic by setting up a separate legal entity with its own governance structure that's focused on addressing that issue. And I think your question, Graham, is an interesting one around this evolution, and I think we think actually both can happen. We think that some will move from left to right, and we have an example at the moment of some work we're doing in the health area, where we think it's probably going to end up with a new hybrid business model emerging at the end of it, because actually it's grown, it's growing, there's real potential with it, and we don't think that probably any of the existing partners will want to take it on in the new, much bigger, ambitious format it will have, and actually we might just end up setting up a new entity to focus on it. But likewise, I think that you are starting to see people come at this with fresh eyes and say, maybe it's almost like the social enterprise on steroids kind of example, thinking, well, actually, let's, when we're thinking about this issue, let's think about this combination of financial and social return from the outset, and maybe start off with that model. So I think we don't know, right? We think that both will happen, and I guess time will tell.
I think I'm right in saying that you're quite careful in the report not to be critical of, if you like, lower orders of partnership. You're not saying that this sort of replaces everything that's gone before. You're just saying that it's a new and emerging trend, a new area.
Absolutely, and I think that's a really important point, because for all of us that work in partnership, we know how difficult it is, and don't add complexity if you don't need to. And actually, for many development issues, partnership may not be the answer. So it's not the sort of panacea answer, and I think we very much recognise that. But what we are seeing, as we said, is this overall trend. And one other thing I do want to add is around innovation and open innovation, because we haven't had time to sort of touch on that. But if we look at the way that businesses are emerging in the private sector, and big businesses are having to open up their businesses to small startups that are innovating, and the ecosystem that's starting to exist around banks, retailers, consumer goods companies, and hearing these companies saying the innovation's going to come from outside rather than within. And last week, when we were running our digital session with our NGO clients, we were sort of pushing a bit on that concept and saying, actually, the same is probably going to apply around international development. And we're going to see these innovations popping up from outside. And to Mark's point, for the next Ebola, how do we actually make sure we tap into some of that innovation that's happening and these new business models that are maybe smaller and more agile?
Very good. Well, there you are, ladies and gentlemen. An interesting set of ideas. Quite challenging, I think, in some of their, although it's a continuum perhaps from ideas of partnership which we've all become familiar with, nonetheless I think there's something quite different in this fourth sector concept. So questions? Is this Anyone got some points for our panel? How does it occur to you? Put your hand up, say you are, and ask you a question. Or is there just no energy in the room? Yes, at the back, thank you.
Yes, just a question about the role of regulation.
Just say who you are.
Ian Welsh from Innovation Forum.
Thanks, Ian.
Question really about the role of government and regulation. It talks about new legal entities. I wondered what sort of new legal entities would you see in the future? What would help in developing the fourth sector, do you think? And how would the wider role of regulation help? Because there is a role for government, I'm sure.
Was that for me?
Yeah, one of you.
I'll start, and then Ian can add to it. So I think we are starting to see new types of legal structures emerging, and one example that is quite well known in the US, but I think less over here, is the B Corp. So it's a new type of legal entity that is kind of focused on a social and a financial mission. So it's kind of taking the for-purpose company, I guess. And that's an interesting legal structure that we're starting to see emerge. And to your point around government, yes, absolutely. I mean, I think what was quite interesting when Accenture conducted the UN Global Compact survey year before last, the CEO survey, we actually found that businesses were asking for regulation, which was not necessarily an outcome that we expected to see. But the role of government and the importance of regulation really came out very strongly. And I guess it touches to your point around tax, Mark, as well, sort of saying, well, actually, if we're going to create a level playing field, we want some strong regulation in here, which means that we're all starting from the same point. Anything to add?
Yeah, just two quick points on that. So I think from the legal structure, it's still early days if anyone's worked in social enterprise and tried to scale those models internationally. So whether it is a different model in the US, UK, one of the clients that we're working with, we were trying to take their social enterprise out of South Asia to Africa. And each country within Africa that we were targeting had a different legal structure. So there was not that simplicity of saying that black and white, private sector or not-for-profit. We're trying to navigate in between it. And of course, we started eating up a lot of legal fees before we even got the project launched. So I think that's a major issue. So that could be one of the roles for government as well about, and again, internationally, how do we start setting some new standards or recognizing these types of hybrid organizations in a different way? And a lot of that, of course, comes if you're for-profit, that's fabulous for some tax reasons. If you're not-for-profit, but then that might also limit you from accessing donor grants, et cetera. How do we kind of navigate that gray space in between? And then just very, very quickly on the role of the government, I mentioned the Global Alliance for Clean Cook Stoves. When we did this kind of exercise about how are we going to really get traction, absolutely guaranteed to fail unless the government is bought into that solution. So when we did all the prioritization, we ran assessments across 16 different countries and then broader beyond. Unless the government was the partner that really wanted to step up, make these commitments, drive it, get their ministries, multiple ministries aligned on that vision, there was no way that we could actually move forward with that mandate. So I know we always talk about that, but if we really want to get to scale and embed this into the local economy and the local way of working, the government is key. So they can play a coordinating role, which we've mentioned in the paper, but then also they've got to bring that legitimacy.
Christelle, I wondered if you'd want to comment. The government is described here as needing to become a choreographer. Now, you've had some interesting relationships with governments, and I'm not talking about tax. I'm talking about regulation as you move from being a service provider of a digital phone system to a bank. So the way that you interact with government is quite central to these kinds of new ideas and innovations.
So absolutely central. And I mentioned earlier that we were present with mobile payment in 7 markets in Africa. And the first question you may ask is, why not more? Why not everywhere where we operate to start with and then beyond? And one of the key challenges that we have is resistance. Obviously, it's a new business model for us because we're not a bank. We're not entitled to make money out of the money float, the electronic float that gets created on M-Pesa. But nevertheless, as you can imagine, the banks see us as a real threat and really campaign for having blocking us from having that license. And actually now, to complicate matters, in countries like Kenya, our banks are now launching their own mobile payment services because they've seen the potential of it, they've seen the impact of it, and that they know that the people this is reaching out to, which is the bottom of the pyramid, are the middle-class customer of within 10 years' time. So it's not just making the money now and reaching out to those customers, it's paving the way for the future. So, but yes, regulation has been an issue. We were lucky in Kenya when we launched, because in a way this just bypassed nobody could foresee the scale and the success of this solution, and things just took off without anybody being able to catch up with it. So in a way, we were really lucky in that market. But in a number of markets, it is still very difficult for us to launch anything. So it's a real labour of love.
Yes, in front.
Thanks. This is a great topic. There's a tension.
Just say who you are.
Sorry, Jonathan Mitchell from Pan International.
Thanks, John.
There's a tension, I think, inherent in this between collaboration and competition. And in the private sector, obviously, companies in the same sector are by nature competitive with each other, and competition drives innovation to a great extent. But also in the international NGO sector, I think we have operated to a large extent, to be honest, as competitors. And I think that the convergence model implies much more collaboration, not just between NGOs and private sector, but within a sector, in the corporate area, and within the international NGO and civil society sector. So I'd just be interested in your thoughts on that. And I'm not sure we can just rely on the government to set the level playing field. I think there's a challenge to civil society as well as to the corporate sector to look at some of the level playing field issues themselves as well.
Thank you. To take the other questions, please.
Nigel Chapman, I'm the CEO of National Local John, so I dominated the conversation. But I want to ask Mark more about how he saw Oxfam organising themselves to take advantage of it. Because you talked about the activists, I'm frankly less worried about the activists, more worried about whether we can get the talent and the staff who can do it, and how you see that, and also how easy it is to convince a board in this modern day and age where there's so much pressure on costs. Centre, you've had one streamline to do with Oxfam GP, to invest in this sort of thing, when to some extent it's inherently speculative, and there's no guarantee of return. So I'm looking more at the internal factor.
Shall we start with Mark? Then there's so the collaboration versus competition, as well as the organisation for success.
Yeah. And they must be linked. And I think it partly goes back to Louise's image about knocking the house down and rebuilding it. And the real issue is how much are we willing to knock down? And probably it's the spare bedroom at the back rather than the whole house, if you're brutally honest about it. Or at least that's where we start. And then we find the foundations are a bit wobbly elsewhere. So I think this does need a different form of thinking. I think many of us have already moved quite significantly along a line that says NGOs doing is never going to change the world, and eventually our supporters will just give up. There are only so many micro projects that you can run and claim will change the world. So that influencing agenda, and I see this as part of that influencing agenda, it's not always campaigning, has got to be a bigger part of our work. And that then becomes less competitive because it often works much better in alliances. And the broad-based alliances of the sort that influence the Chancellor to deal with this, or the government of Mozambique to do with that, or tomorrow the Afghan peace talks to deal with something else, feels like more of the way to go. And I think we are far better at those kinds of policy collaborations than we are at the project-related ones where you're raising money for this project in this place. So that's part of the journey. And I stress, as I said at the beginning, that this is all about moving along the continuum rather than just getting to level 4. And then the other point is really about the competence of the agency to do it. And we can't pretend we are very skilled at this. So to give you a very real example, yesterday I sat in a meeting. We have a sub-board of what is basically an Oxfam investment fund. It's a social investment fund. And the thing they were complaining about was rightly that all of our staff in every country spend all of their life talking about policies, procedures, and other kinds of activities rather than getting on and facing the client and delivering the work. They were working like NGO activists rather than working like business people who were trying to actually appraise an investment, make the loan if need be, and then manage the relationship thereafter. So it means we've got to recruit different staff. So going back to that question of legal entities, I think there's quite a lot in the kind of model where, Oxfam is proud to have contributed to the launching of Cafe Direct. We have nothing to do with it now. It's a business with a different set of ethics, but it's run as a business by business people. So I think there's something in that kind of model, and maybe the fourth generation is really catching up with that kind of work, which is to say, how are you using the power of the market and the social end together? I don't see it as a big problem from our board's point of view. In a sense, our job is to make the case. The board are open to listen to it. I think where our board rightly get challenging is when we keep talking about more and more traditional NGO projects as the basis of our work. But of course, the lesson there, as you know, Nigel, is choose your board carefully.
Yeah, just where Christelle's got it as it's coming through. Christelle, you talked about private sector to private sector collaboration, where you're the digital guys and you're working with GSK or Barclays or different businesses, about collaboration within your sector. I can imagine your board would have a few things to say about that.
Ooh, I was hoping you wouldn't ask for that.
But that's kind of where it goes, though. These ideas within sector collaboration.
So I can give you examples of where we collaborated with within our own sector, which is in the human rights space. So following the in terms of policy.
Yeah.
So following the fallout of what was happened, the fallout in Egypt, and what's happened in Egypt, we had to react and do something. So to give you a little bit of background, revolution in Egypt, we are one of the mobile providers over there, and as you may or may not know, to be a telecom operators in a country, we need to be given a license and some spectrum to be able to operate. The only body who can give us that is a government. So we are reporting de facto to the government. So we were asked by the government to basically switch off the network in a zone where the trouble was happening. And to make matters worse, we're also asked to disseminate text messages on behalf of the government. So behind closed doors, but I think this is being filmed. We were as inefficient as broadcasting Cairo. We were obviously conscious of there's two angle. We knew that obviously to a certain extent, we had to do what we were told for the safety of our own people and our responsibility towards our business. However, we also knew this was not the right thing to do in terms of civil society and human rights. So we were stuck between the two. So we found a compromise at the time where we basically dragged our feet to a large extent and blamed technology not working for not really delivering what we're being asked to do. So that's how we got away with it. But however, we realized very quickly that we needed to collaborate with our competitors in across the world to come up with a set of principles that we would follow together and basically stick together and apply whenever this would happen again. And in a nutshell, without looking into the detail of the long document, is we now agree between ourselves that if we get asked to do this again, we will say, fine, we will do it, government, we will do it, but the principle is we will post on the internet the details of the person from the government who asked us to do this. So basically saying we're the conductor, but a named person had basically given us the order. And the effect of this is that it's a fantastic deterrent. I can't name the country where this similar situation happened. We were asked to do exactly the same thing, and the problem went away. So obviously we can't brag about it, But internally, we're immensely proud. It's not something we can write a case study about, not to embarrass that government who did ask us to do it again. But the coalition, the force that we had by collaborating worked really well. But obviously, it's not commercial.
No,
so,
no, it's a good example. Louise.
No, just to respond around the competitive point, yes, you're absolutely right, and I find it quite interesting being in discussions with companies around their partnerships and then being very clear that this is competitive for them, and actually that they don't want us to discuss it publicly, and that's fine, right? Because they are a business. But we're seeing, Christelle gave one example. We're also seeing in the area around nutrition, for example. I think the example might be referenced in the report where a group of companies have got together with GAIN, the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition, to create this pre-competitive platform around research. So I think there are certain areas like R&D where actually companies say we will collaborate together, but then we will, as soon as it's a case of getting the products to market, we are going to absolutely compete head on.
And then just to build upon that, coming back to the other earlier question about the role of the state, by getting the U.S. government and to actually host the event at the White House was what was one of the key catalysts for actually getting the senior levels from the large consumer packaged goods companies together. So that's another kind of example of the convening role. And then just quickly, for the point on NGO to NGO collaboration, one of the big trends that we've been seeing and a huge opportunity, which is very much in sync with the paper, is working with multiple of our NGO clients together on these interesting innovations, programs that they've done, and then jointly going out to donors to fund a bigger solution that we can take to scale. So whether it's a technology that one organization has developed and then is sharing with another, could we set this up as a hybrid organization? And that's one of the initiatives that we're pursuing. So I do think that there is this space for a common interest and for multiple NGOs to band together to actually attract some of the evasive funding.
We have time for one more quick question. Amanda, you got your hand up quick. Say who you are.
Amanda Bowman from the Partnering Initiative. I think it's a fantastic concept and something that we certainly appreciate at the Partnering Initiative. But there's been a lot of mention about how partnership is hard, and so therefore convergence is hard, creating the fourth sector concept is hard. For me, the issues that have come up very strongly are the notions of the need to be nimble, the need to go fast to get the innovations working, and this whole notion of keeping it simple. And within this concept of convergence, which isn't simple, it can be complex, and with new models and legal models and so on and so forth, what can we do within companies to skill up our people to be better at making this happen?
So it overlaps with the competency question. Yeah.
Inside our
Yeah.
Yes, very good question. I don't mind answering that actually, because I took a note of a question that was earlier about taking event. How do we take advantage of it, which is linked with the barriers and that comes with it. So, for example, looking at the work we're doing in our business, that businesses are typically organized to deliver in silos, each to their own, with their own P&L, and they know what they're doing. We're all supposed to be organized like good little soldiers, and and with a top and different layers and organized like this, and that doesn't go very well with this idea of the fourth sector. So internally, for example, the work that I'm doing is straddling between strategic customer engagement to being commercial to certain extent, but yet is quite different. Just internally, the complexity about where is it best to sit, because it sits across different. So I think so the skills required there is to one that's based on trust, and one based on matrix organization, that ability, that kind of nimbleness that enables you to think, I don't just belong here and I deliver here just about my goals. It's about working across business units and for the company as a whole, and also to seize the long term. So it's a mindset of long term, 360, engagement within the business and different ways of rewarding people, and that's difficult. That's very, very difficult, because it's at the heart of how corporates work, sadly. So it's One idea bouncing on this actually is one I've come across recently going to Switzerland. A company called the Thressel Group. I probably don't pronounce it very well with my French accent, but they have a foundation that was very, very interesting. And I'm not one to believe in philanthropic activity per se. I believe a lot in business to save the world. But they have this interesting program where they pair up women social entrepreneur in emerging markets with leaders, stars, rising stars within corporate businesses in Europe, with a view of setting up almost like a coaching support from that business into those women entrepreneurs in emerging market. That, I think, is a fantastic vehicle to change the mindset of people, of rising stars within the business, and help them work across business units. So it's coming from externally, and it's taking them out of their normal context. So stuff like this, which is, also appealing to people's heart and what will make them drive with their heart. So I hope that makes sense.
That you think it's going to be quite a challenging step for you to take, and may require some new staff indeed to be able to adopt the capabilities. Anything further to add in terms of how you can move quickly?
Yeah, I think we've got two different drivers. One is the staff I was talking about earlier just did not have that commercial experience or mindset. So that's where we needed different staff on those kinds of activities. But I think we, as many NGOs, we have a culture which doesn't respond quickly to opportunities. And I think we probably all got to learn ways of adapting to that. And I think there's something in that quasi-independent entity, that little self-contained cell, or that program that can be separated from, still accountable to and driven by the values of the parents, but not the detailed processes. And I think that's going to have to be part of our learning on this journey. We haven't got that right yet. And too often our culture keeps people moving in the right direction, but doesn't keep us moving fast enough or innovatively enough.
Louise, and also, I think in the interest of time, your closing thoughts.
Okay. And just on this point around adapting within business, we've been working on something called social entrepreneurship with Business Fights Poverty. I don't have time to go into it today, but Google it, because I think that's a really interesting way of how we're seeing employees within large multinationals who have new business model ideas that have this social and financial return. And actually what we're seeing is when you bring them all together in the same room, it's like an epiphany. They're like, oh, here's someone else who thinks the same way that I do. And they meet their peers from different companies, and they're able to share their experiences and really bounce off each other in terms of how they can take that business model forward in their company. So just to close out, thank you so much, Graham, and our panel members. Really appreciate your coming here today. Please don't go home and say you're going to knock your house down, because we might be popular with the builder community, just the spare room, exactly. Oh, to have one in London, I mean, forgot. No, I hope that you think that this fourth sector, it's a provocative term, but we think there are new, different, emerging models that we're going to be seeing. And I think in a few years' time, we'll be sitting here talking about these new hybrid business models.
Very good. Well, thank you, Louise and Ian, for bringing these ideas to us. A very interesting report. Please join me in thanking the panel.